Well, hi there and welcome back. We are continuing in the Psalms. We're Psalm 55 today. Psalm 55 is one of those Psalms that make us uncomfortable. I've talked about before, a imprecatory Psalm where David is, in this case, David is calling down judgment upon his enemies. If you're wondering, is that appropriate for us to pray? I'd encourage you to go find the video that I recorded about imprecatory psalms, and I give you some guidance there on how to use these psalms in your own prayer life. But for this particular psalm, back to Psalm 55, I've labeled this betrayal, and I'm afraid that a lot of us, most of us, maybe I dare say all of us, at some point in our life experienced betrayal. Well, this is another one of those mass kill Psalms of David. Let me show you the psalm here. One of those mass kill Psalms of David that we run into, and this is David sharing from his own experience, wisdom that he's learned, and laying it all out there for us. And by God's grace, God instructs us through these things, instructs us from the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. You know, I like what Paul says in Romans 15, I think, verse 4, that these things were written to us to give us hope and confidence, these Old Testament Psalms and everything else. As I read this psalm, and perhaps you'll encounter the same thing as you read it today, it seems to me that for a guy who was set apart for God, for a critical, really critical role in the covenant outworkings of God's plan, David had a really tough life. I think it's a good warning for all of us as we see examine the lives of Joseph, Moses, Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all three of them. And again, of course, the life of David and the life of our Lord himself. We see room to take sober assessment of what it means to be called by God and how he brings glory to himself through us and through these godly men, and gives us a goal, I think, to shoot for, to stand firm in the Lord, no matter what the world throws at us. And in this case, in verses 13 and 14, what David is experiencing is the betrayal of an apparently very close friend, just as the Lord was betrayed by Judas. Verses 1 through 7, as you read through this, I've kind of laid this out by the selahs that are there. So after verse 7, there's a selah. 1 through 7, we see David being really honest with God about his emotional shock at his betrayal. You know, you can be honest with God. You could really lay it out there for him. He knows. He wants to hear it from you. He wants to see from you. And what does he find in David? He finds complaining. He finds David being distracted, in anguish. David's terrified and fearful and horror-stricken and wishing he could just fly away and escape. David is just laying all this out before the Lord without any apparent embarrassment or reluctance that he is coming to his Father. He's coming to God, and he's laying out this dire emotional state that he finds himself in. And I think that is the first step for anybody who's facing either betrayal or some other thing that's really renting you emotionally, is to confess it to the Lord. Confess the effect that sin is having upon your life. Of course, your sin, but the focus here is the sin of others. When others sin against you and results in just emotional turmoil before you, bring that to the Lord. Verses 8 through 19, again, David confesses that if he could, he'd just flee and leave it to the Lord. But this is another of those imprecatory psalms where he calls on God in verse 9. Let me scroll down here a little bit. He calls on God to bring against them judgment. He calls on God to hinder their language in order to keep them from plotting evil. And he even in verse 15 pleads for their death. Let death come deceitfully upon them. So here David is asking for what we called talionic judgment, that is eye for eye. David's adversary is apparently bringing this deceitful death upon David, sneaking up on him and killing him. David's asking for that to fall to the man who's betraying him. And again, we see the Lord shining through here, the fuller embodiment of this type of David. Jesus becomes the antitype with his betrayal by Judas, a trusted member of the 12, someone who they trusted to handle the money for the group, someone that apparently no one expected. So David here calls for judgment upon his betrayer. Verses 20 to 23 then, as you continue to read through this little bit lengthy psalm, 20 to 23, we see David closes the psalm much more calmly, I think, than when he started it. We see David in the end here placing his trust in God and calls the whole nation to join him in this. So really beautiful picture here. What often happens to us in prayer, we start out in turmoil and we end up in peace. And haven't you all experienced this at some point in your life where you feel overwhelmed or betrayed or in some other way hurt, and you bring that to the Lord and you turn it over to the Lord as David does here, and then you end up walking away from what started out as a very emotionally tumultuous situation, and you walk away in great peace, Let me challenge you in light of what David is teaching us here in terms of a mass skill for the community, for the church, for the nation of Israel, but we're going to apply it to ourselves here in a second, that perhaps when God has done that to you, he has provided you with that peace in the midst of chaos, a peace that comes upon you with in confidence of what God is going to do, that you should not only enjoy that, and you should, and recognize what God has done, but tell somebody else. Tell someone else about how you have found peace in the midst of turmoil, how the Lord has met you in prayer, how you have taken Psalm 55 and turned it into a prayer for yourself, and how God has given you the peace that David experienced, and he's shared that with you. Perhaps that's the next step that you need to take. Again, I know I have many friends who are part of Stephen's ministries that this would be useful for, but also for anybody, for all of you who are part of a church where we are supposed to be encouraging others to love and good deeds, that you can work from your own and speak from your own experience on how God has taken care of you. And that's what David does here. He says at the end, that not only will you trust in the Lord, but he will proclaim this to the congregation. That's why we have it in the book of Psalms. That's why it's a mass skill for us. So let's look at our here verse, highlight, explain, apply, and respond. Notice these words, his speech, his heart, his words. David is just reflecting on what's happened to him. There's nothing probably that's going to make your stomach drop and your eyes well up with tears faster than those who are betraying you, especially those you've trusted. Smooth speech, interior, he's at war with himself and at war with you perhaps, but his words come across as creamy, softer than oil. These are words of betrayal. That's what he says in the last clause of that verse. They are drawn swords. Swords, the betrayal of a friend, is devastating and painful in our lives. And as I said, many of you know this from personal experience. Perhaps all of us know this from personal experience. My hope for you really is that you have not suffered a betrayal like this, but I know some of you have. But my prayer is that you don't have to go through this in your marriage, in your family, or among your friends, but many of you have. It's just a sad reality. You have people in your lives that have betrayed you. And right now, again, I would venture to guess that you have people in your lives that are also suffering betrayal. Betrayal at the hands of a spouse or another family member, or perhaps somebody in the church, or even friends. I've experienced several of these, and probably the more painful that I've experienced is to be betrayed by people in the church. To a certain extent, you expect this from unbelievers, right? So if you have an unbelieving spouse or unbelieving members of your family or unbelieving friends and they betray you, it's still painful, but it's not so much of a surprise when you understand that they don't know the Lord. But it's people who profess to know the Lord, people who profess to be Christians who care about you. That I think that's painful. So I'm with you there, and this is how we can respond to that. I pray that we both, you and I both, turn that hurt into hope for somebody else. Look for an opportunity to help someone who's experiencing this now, or perhaps have experienced betrayal, and guide them back toward a confession of trust in the Lord. Confidence that he will punish ultimately the evildoers, that their deeds will be made known. So, brothers and sisters, I am sorry for those of you who have experienced this betrayal as David has, this betrayal as the Lord has. But you are in good company, and you've been well equipped. So don't waste it. God never wastes a hurt, neither should you. God bless you, brothers and sisters.